Welcome to Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, session 48, the book of Esther. I was hoping to get this class prepared before I left on our vacation to New York, and did not. Failed miserably. And so last night, yesterday, when I sat down to work on it, and I put in the situation schedule between Nehemiah. Yeah. And then I sat down and I went open because I was using the last class of slides for the review, and I realized that though I'd written Ezra at the top of the slides, we did both Ezra and Nehemiah in the last session. So I was like, oh, well then, darn. So if you caught my post in the Facebook members group, I said if you read Nehemiah, you got great review. But if you wanted to be ahead, you could read Esther. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Is Esther. Sorry about that. I'm always confused. Not always. I'm often confused. Often 50-50, we'll say. But we'll get started right away because we're going to cover the whole book. And really, I mean, when I do this class, I try to kind of like hit the highlights of the book or something like that. And with the book of Esther, like just picking parts of it, it's impossible because so much of the story is so good. And if I leave a section out, it'd be like leaving out a scene from a play. So we'll talk a little more about that as we get in. But let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. And the prayer I've got for us is right here on the screen. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and has commanded us concerning the reading of the Megillah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who performed miracles for our forefathers in those days at this time. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has granted us life, sustained us, and enabled us to reach this occasion. Amen. So this is actually a Jewish prayer, hence the Jewish word in it. These are the three blessings that the rabbi would pray before you read the Megillah, or scroll, that's Hebrew for scroll of Esther. So I thought it would be an appropriate prayer for us to have before we enter into the story. But before we get there, just a little review for those of you who may be new to the Hebrew Bible, or with our last class so long ago, you cannot remember what we have to talk about. So there are three texts that I always use in preparing these that I always commend to you. The first is your wonderful New Oxford Annotated Bible, here in this beautiful Netherlands edition. But it's a wonderful ecumenical study Bible, great notes, highly commend it to you. If you want just a brief overview, I really like Fee and Stewart, how to read the Bible book by book. Fee and Stewart are evangelical biblical scholars, but they're just giving you mainstream scholarship. One of the real, to me, blessings, I think this is true in so many fields, is that once you get into actual, doctoral level academic work, conservative, liberal, evangelical, Catholic, Episcopalian, a lot of that kind of fades away because it's good academic work. There are always people on the outside who will be a little more tendentious in their arguments, but most of the time, if it's good academic work, it's good academic work. Fee and Stewart do good academic work. And then if you want a specific book on Esther, I really love Carol Bettel's book on Esther as a part of the
She's a Western Summer.
Is she really? Oh, Bechtel. All right, Carol Bechtel's book on Esther. It's a very slender volume, but it's a really lovely engagement with the book. So there we go with a little Western Seminary shout out today. Oh, and we have Melissa joining us online. We'll give Melissa a second to connect on. Are you there with us, Melissa?
Yep.
Great. So Bechtel, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Wonderful. And that's the book I use to kind of prepare us for today. So if Carol Bechtel decides to at some point watch this on YouTube, she will realize that I'm largely privy to her entire commentary. So I'm saying that out loud. This is considered the footnote to the presentation. We're really relying on we have Bechtel and her work with this text. But let's do some review first. To remember Ezra and Nehemiah, if you can, from our last class months ago. So what two books were originally written as a single scroll, only later to be divided by medieval Christian Bibles? Kind of an obvious question. Hey, Ezra and Nehemiah, excellently done. Now the real question, does anybody remember what the name was before they were divided? Esdras, E-S-D-R-A-S, that's the name before it was divided, which is just the Greek version of Ezra. Also, first Esdras, Greek rendering of Ezra's name in the Septuagint. First Esdras, the single volume, was the version most common in the early church, because remember, the early church largely used the Septuagint for their scriptures. Does anybody remember what part of Israel's story? There's always going to be profound titles in these presentations. I just apologize for that. Treat it as though you're reading Matt's night. We just don't pay attention to the titles, right, Matt? There it is. What part of Israel's story does Ezra and Nehemiah cover? Anyone remember?
Return from exile.
Return from exile, yes. Using the memoirs, journals we don't know of Ezra and Nehemiah, along with other sources, they describe the rebuilding and reform in post-exilic Judah through the latter half of the first century, but we will accept return from exile as a shorter answer than what I put on the screen. So that's what they're covering. How are these books significant for Judaism? I don't know if I can remember this. So this period witnesses the emergence of Judaism proper, as distinct in certain important ways from pre-exilic Israelite religion. And I can't emphasize this enough. And I get into these conversations sometimes with people who, want to draw a direct line between Judaism as we understand it today and ancient Israelite religion, and you simply cannot do that. Ancient Israelite religion is very hard actually to reconstruct. There's a lot of scholarly debate about how uniform it was and how diverse it was. There's a great book, Folk Religion in Ancient Israel, that I love, that really unpacks what probably the actual religion of the people looked like, recognizing that most of the texts we have that describe ancient Israelite religion were written around the time of the exile to make a polemical argument about what the religion should be, as opposed to a description of what it was. And so what we see in Ezra and Nehemiah as they return from exile is how they're now building religion in this time. So really it gets a lot closer for us in terms of a better sense of what's probably happening as opposed to some of the reconstructions we see in other texts. What is essential in these books? These are really great short answer questions for like the week after the lecture, right? What's essential in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah? Hello, Carolyn, welcome. Good to see you there. Essential in the books are the successful completion of both the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. It's the big job. Despite opposition, also essential in Ezra and Nehemiah are questions of purity of faith. We're doing the covenant with Yahweh compared to the other gods through keeping the law. And so, for example, one of the big debates in Ezra and Nehemiah is this whole question of intermarriage. What do we do with Jewish people who married during the exile? Or what do we do with the people who are in the land when they return, who claim that they're the real Israelite people because they were carried off in exile? They've been here the past 70 years, but the exile was like, no, we carry the torch of exile. So a lot of the debate is between those two groups and who actually constitutes Judaism, with Ezra and Nehemiah naturally reflecting the view of the exilic authors and post-exilic authors. All right. God's promise and emperor's decree. Does anyone remember who it was who sent the Jewish exiles home at the start of Ezra and Nehemiah? Yeah, go for it. Darius. Darius, close. He's the second most important person. Xerxes, yeah. Or Cyrus, depending how you translate it. King Cyrus was the Persian king, 559 to 520, who conquered Babylon in 539, founded the Persian Empire. Ezra begins with the same text and the Second Chronicles. The Second Chronicles says literally they use the same verse in both books. The proclamation of return was Cyrus's action being paid when Yahweh's commanded. In the text, it says, I, Cyrus, have been commanded by Yahweh to send the people home. Probably didn't happen. That's being put into his mouth, more kind of acknowledging that. But just to remind you, this is so important whenever we talk about I feel confused about the name. So with a lot of these names, you've got the original name in the original language, you've got the Hebrew version, you've got the Greek version, you've got the Latin version, and then you've got the English version. So depending on how your translation handles it will affect whether you see Xerxes or Cyrus. Just to remind you all kind of that general, if there's nothing you get on the Hebrew Bible, at least you catch this one point of history, that you have tribal federation, a united kingdom of Israel, That is then in the 8th century, conquered by what empire? Assyrian first, 8th century. It's all right. Assyrian Empire of the 8th century. That was the big empire then. And then the Assyrian Empire is conquered by the Babylonian Empire. So by the time we get to the 6th century, it's Babylon now who invades and conquers the southern nation. Then the Babylonian Empire is conquered by the Persian Empire, the Mede-Persian Empire, more accurately. And I want to remind people of that because when you're understanding and engaging with Middle Eastern history, these are all places that are real. Assyrian Empire, that's Syria, right? The Babylonian Empire, that's Iraq. And the Persian Empire, that's Iran. So these areas and nations have had their chance, their moment on the stage. And then your bonus question, of course, the Persian Empire is conquered by the Greek Empire, right? Alexander conquers them, and then the Greek Empire is conquered by the Roman Empire. So that's kind of your general history of civilization. It's important to catch that. And every time there's that global shift in power, there's a microcosm of it seen in Israel, of the way that global shift in power affects Israel. And Israel, as an independent, sovereign nation with no one over it, has not existed since the first Assyrian invasion of the 8th century. It's always been a vassal state in some way. And in fact, there are scholars that suggest, that the debate whether Israel was ever truly its own sovereign nation, but because there's power with Egypt and everything. Just want to remind, because when we talk about contemporary history, this is all weighted by thousands of years of regional conflict. So was Cyrus following Yahweh? Probably not. In fact, the contemporary archaeological evidence we use to remember this is something called the Cyrus cylinder. It's an ancient clay cylinder written in cuneiform that talks about Cyrus's approach. He was very cosmopolitan. The old approach was you conquer a nation, you expatriate, you deport the leadership, you spread them out, you eliminate their religion, because their religion is going to keep them fighting against you. That was the way it was always done. The Persian Empire, they said, no. That's a horrible idea. Conquer them, sure. But then let them have their own religion, keep them happy as long as they continue to pay. That's all. If they continue to pay and accept our authority, we don't care what religion they have. That was a massively cosmopolitan and new thought that the Persian Empire had. And so, was it God who did that, or was that the Persians, or somehow both? I will leave that to you to decide.
Yeah. You can think of it as a buffer state, as a satellite, a member of the Warsaw Pact.
Yes.
Something in between Persia and Egypt, which is can be handy.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. So in Ezra and Nehemiah, they're at work rebuilding the altar of the temple in Jerusalem. Does anybody remember what slowed the work of rebuilding? Tension with the local inhabitants and the neighboring people. This is a major theme, which is some see here the tension between the returning Judeans and those who remain regarding who constitutes authentic Israel. This is one of the big conflicts in Ezra and Nehemiah. How did the people respond when they finally did rebuild and found the second temple? What was the response of the people? Were they happy? Were they sad? Were they angry? Were they enthusiastic? Did they not care? It was a mixture. There was great rejoicing, but also great weeping by older people who remembered the splendor of Solomon's temple and who saw the rebuilt temple as being just something that really paled in comparison. Because you have to remember as well, of course, right? There's the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, which moved around. There's then the Solomon's temple, which was constructed by Solomon, which is this amazing, beautiful, profound work, at least if we believe how it's described. Then there's the second temple, which was constructed by the exiles, which was constructed by a bunch of refugees who got back home. I mean, this was a simple temple compared to Solomon, which is then, of course, why Herod, right, build Herod's temple, which is a large expansion of the second temple, because he's trying so desperately to get the people to like him. This reminds me, I just got back from New York and saw Hamilton. Reminds me a lot of King George and Hamilton, right? You'll be back. Herod's trying so desperately, he does these massive building projects. So the second temple was a very different thing than Solomon's temple. Oh, we lost the white in the back.
Of course, Solomon's temple got even bigger and more beautiful in their memory.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, right. That's always
our description of Solomon's temple is written down later.
Yes, and that's why it's so hard to get out what of this is history and what is not. I don't know my white background up here, so you can't read that. I'll tell you, when the rebuilding is questioned, so they kind of come in and they're like, wait, why are you rebuilding this temple? They bring out an archive of the original decree from Cyrus, which includes something new. The archival version emphasizes the building size and funding, but is also more generous in the public version of the Ezra 1, explicitly saying that the empire is going to pay for it. So it's this funny moment because in Ezra 1, it's just like, go build the temple. And then when they bring out the like why are you rebuilding? It's like, oh, we got this decree from Cyrus. Oh, that's like, you're going to pay them for it right here. Oh, that's it's kind of, I think that's hilarious. That's just me being a joke. So the emperor offers support, which shows us there it is. This is Matt's question. So the new emperor, because now Cyrus is no longer there. The new emperor offers support to help pay for the building of the temple. That new emperor is. You were right the first time. Darius. There you go. See, you're just a little early. Darius' support. So Darius helps. Now his support's likely exaggerated a little bit. But at the same time, it could indicate Persia's attempt to stabilize its hold on the Mediterranean by exploring the goodwill of the people of Yehud, which is what you call this province at this point. And this is something that he did. Non-biblical sources show similar support that Persia offered, for example, Egypt's religious institutions. So this is a part of the Mede-Persian religious policy as it tried to maintain control of its empire. So just I'd like to remind you all of that. Months ago that we did that work, but that all of this history is so important for really getting at what's going on in the Hebrew scriptures, and it relates to what we're going to be covering today, which is taking this grand sweep of a religious world history narrative, and we're now taking the camera, we're zooming in on one particular story within this time, which is the story of Esther. All right, so let's talk a little bit about historical context here. The book of Esther is named for its heroine, a Jewish woman of the diaspora who becomes queen of Persia and saves her people, thereby inaugurating the new Jewish festival of Purim. And I will say Purim is a huge deal. I've been in Israel during Purim. It is like Mardi Gras on steroids. People are excited, they're dressed up, they're partying. And when you read the story of Esther during Purim, it's a community engagement. So, for example, when you come along and you say the name of Haman, everyone goes, boo, hit, boo, hit. It's this amazing community experience of telling the story of Esther. So it's coming out of that tradition. Esther has a Hebrew name, which is given as Hadassah, but as is common in the ancient Near East, she is also called by a Persian named Esther, which seems to be a cognate of Ishtar, who is the Babylonian goddess of love and war. And in fact, some scholars really think that what you see in Esther is an argument between different regional powers. You have Ishtar for Persia. Her uncle is Mordecai, which is very similar to Marduk, who's the Babylonian god, right? And Haman is very similar. So there's some debate there. Ishtar was the Babylonian goddess of love and war. If you're thinking, I know that, I've heard that word before, that's because there are always people who think Easter comes from the celebrations related to Ishtar or Esther. That's not true. The fact of the matter is spring festivals roll around, and this is kind of a spring festival, and so there are some relations of names, but not relations of development. The book of Esther either takes place during the reign of Xerxes the First, 464 to 665, or Artaxerxes II, 405 to 359. We're not really quite sure which. But it would basically put it before or after the events of Ezra and Nehemiah, which kind of take place in the middle of those, in the middle of the 5th century. Scholars debate about when exactly to place Esther in what exact time period, but probably around the 5th century, like there. So that's historical context, but there are tremendous historical problems with Esther. For example, there are historical inconsistencies, there's a symmetry of themes and events, a plenitude of quoted dialogue, and no one was really there taking notes. This indicates for most people that they think that this book is a work of historical fiction. It's a novella written by someone, a historical novella about a historical time. And we're familiar with this work, right? I've written historical fiction where you take in historical context and maybe even real people and then write a novel about them. So that's what the kind of most scholars think this is. And a lot of scholars also think that that maybe there probably perhaps never even was an Esther or you know, who was queen. You know, none of that seems likely historically. And so what they're really doing is they have the festival of Purim and they need a reason for it. So they come up with a story to give it in and invite them the party, right? So there's scholars debate about that as well. I don't know the answer. One of the other problems with Esther is God does not show up in the book. God is absent from the book of, there's no, the word God, Elohim, Yahweh does not exist in the book of Esther. And in fact, the book of Esther also has more Akkadian and Aramaic loanwords than any other book of scripture. So it's not even terribly Hebrew or Jewish in its composition. So it's very much coming out of that post-exilic time. It was the last of the books of the Tanakh, which is the name of the Hebrew Bible, right? Tanakh, from Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the Torah, the law, the Nevi'im, the prophets, the Ketuvim, the writings. This was the last one to be canonized by the Great Assembly. It exists in 2 versions, the Hebrew version, and then there's a Greek version as well, which is dated generally to the 2nd century. It tells the story differently. It's actually a lot bigger. And so, for example, if you have this Bible, the New Oxford Annotated, you have the book of Esther, which is the Hebrew version in the Bible, and then in the Deuterocanonical section, you have something called the rest of the book of Esther, which is what they add on to it in the Greek version of the book. Luther doubted it was of any value to the canon, so he wanted to kind of get rid of it. Song of Solomon is similar in that way, because Song of Solomon also talks a lot about God. What's fascinating, given the desire to push Esther and Song of Solomon out of the canon, is that they are also the only 2 books of scripture with strong themes of female sexuality. So that's another reason why they're kind of scary to those in power, I think, in some ways. They have very powerful female figures. The Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation reaffirmed that it is indeed a part of scripture. It remains a part of our Bible, of course, in the Episcopal Church. And as I said, most scholars suggest we should read it as a novella rather than a work of history. And if you do that, you'll get more out of it. In the same way that we talked about before in this class, when you read the book of Jonah, don't read Jonah as history. Jonah is the Daily Show. It is parody, it is satire, it's Mad Magazine, telling a story to poke at you. And the same way that that's what Jesus did, right? No one thinks that all of the parables Jesus told were real stories of things that happened, right? That's not how it works in the ancient world. You come up with a good story to tell someone something. That's what all good literature does. So to read, really, you're going to do best if you read Esther that way rather than spending all your time getting caught up on historical questions. So, questions about introduction before we jump into the text itself? Yeah, right.
The books like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, are they being written by Jewish scholars then when after they return to Jerusalem, the captivity is over, you got a group that goes back? Is that when we think that these are written?
That's a really good question. So Ezra and Nehemiah, probably yes, were probably composed around that time. And it seems to be, from what they say within the books, that they're using the journals of these prophets as a source material. They also seem to be using some other national sources as well, but kind of cobbling together to write. The book of Esther is a little trickier, though. So what most scholars think is that probably it began as an oral narrative that was told after the exile of the story of, Queen Esther married the king of Persia. And then they kind of told the story, then eventually people wrote it down in its Hebrew form. The story kept being told and eventually gets written in its Greek form. Part of that as well, scholars wonder, is, so you've got kind of 3 groups of Jewish people existing in this time. You have the Jewish people who were carried off to exile in Babylon, right? And who then wind up becoming a part of Babylon, a part of Persia. And a lot of Judaism from exilic culture is heavily influenced by Babylonian and Jewish thought. I mean, in Persian thought. I mean, that's a huge part of what's going on. So you have that group. You have the group of people who remained in the land who were not exiled off, because you don't empty the land out. So there's the Jewish people who remained in the land after the destruction. But then you also have the community of Jewish exiles who live in Alexandria in Egypt, which wind up being heavily influenced by the Greek Empire. So sometimes scholars state that one of the possible sources for the two books is the story was told around by Jewish people, and then the kind of the community that came out of the Babylonian exile and came home wrote it down in Hebrew. The people that were a part of the exile in Egypt and who were working more in Greek wrote it in Greek. And so that's why you wind up with the two competing narratives, is one of the theories scholars have. And so for the Hebrew form, they think is probably written sometime in the 4th century, around 100 years after the event is forced to describe, whereas the Greek form is generally seen to be written in the 2nd century, about 300 years after. And now, that feels like a long time to us, I know. We have to remember, stuff like the Torah, which was being compiled probably around the 7th, 6th century, was describing stuff hundreds and hundreds of years ago, And so that's kind of a reality that this is actually a lot closer to the events. So there's probably a deeper connection there. Good question. Other questions before we dig in? We got a Bible in hand. Do you want to turn to the book of Esther? You can, or you can survive my reading of it. So we'll begin with chapter 1. This happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the same Ahasuerus who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in the citadel of Susa in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his officials and ministers. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were present, while he displayed the great wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and pomp of his majesty for many days, 180 days in all. So, the operative word here is excess. This is being told to you tongue-in-cheek. The author is making fun of Ahasuerus here. You can suspect in the first verse, of course, Ahasuerus is not the actual name of any Persian king. It literally means mighty man. So whether that's Xerxes or Artaxerxes, we don't know. But mighty man who rules over 127 provinces. No. Persia probably had about 30 provinces, not 127. So this is being massively exaggerated for the purpose of the narrative. He's not simply in the capital, but he's in the citadel of Susa, which is the setting for this lavish banquet. Literally in Hebrew, it's drinking party. It's not banquet. That the king hosts for all his officials and ministers, a huge gathering. And I mean, 128 days of party, right? And the whole purpose of it, right, is Ahasuerus wants to show off his wealth and his power. So just because this is described in lavish terms does not imply the author's approval. And this is why I really think when we read scripture, consider tone of voice. Because if you read that, you can read this and this is a very serious thing. It's very, very powerful and good. And this must be a great person. Or you can read this, in the 3rd year, you give all this, and it's the army. So you have that tone of voice. You can see this is mocking Ahasuerus, who supposedly is a powerful person. Continuing on, actually I'll start in verse 5. When those days were completed, the king gave for all the people, then there's just more of the party, so we're going to skip that. On this, verse 10, on the 7th day, so this is after 180 days, on the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, remember it's a drinking party, he commanded Mehuman, Bitha, Harbona, Bigna, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who attended to him, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing the royal crown, in order to show the people, to the officials, her beauty, for she was fair to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs. At this, the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. And the king consulted the sages who knew the laws, for this was the king's procedure towards all who were versed in law and custom. And those next to him were Shina, Shethar, Matha, Tarshish, Meredith, Marcina, and Memucan, the 7 officials of the Persia and Media who had access to the king. Sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only has Queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials, all the people in the province of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen will be made known to all women. Husbands look with contempt on their husbands. So they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she didn't come. And this very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will rebel against the king's officials. There will be no end of contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and Medes, so that it may not be altered, that Vashti is never again to come before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who was better than she. So when the decree was made by the king, it proclaimed throughout the kingdom, vast as it was, that all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. Right? Come on now. Once again, this is the king wants to show Vashti off. It says wearing her royal crown, as though she's the prime piece of property. Because that's what the whole point of the party. Showing my power, showing my wealth. I'm going to bring my queen here and show her off as well, like a piece of property. Rabbis, rabbinical interpretation suggested that she refused to come because she was expected to come wearing only the crown. That's exactly a rabbinical interpretation. When he says bring Vashti out wearing the crown, he meant just the crown. So she refused to come. She's not going to do that. But we don't know for sure if that's what's going on. That's a rabbinical interpretation. Regardless, Vashti says, no, I will not be trotted out before everyone. Demonstrating that, despite his wealth and power, he's impotent. He cannot control her. So once again, he's saying early in the text, with all this mighty man, with all this power, and here this one single woman says no, and it cuts to the heart of his supposed power. Memucan protects the king's ego, saying, oh no, it's not just you who's humiliated. All men clearly would be humiliated by this. And so we need to have a law of every man to listen, every woman to listen to her husband. Right? So now what I love about this, once again, if you read this according to tone of voice, is what I detected in this is a very subtle, or maybe not so subtle, push against patriarchy. Because remember, the author of Esther does not think the king and the Persians are right. He thinks they're a bunch of buffoons. That's the whole point. And so what you see here are these women who are pushing against the patriarchy and are unsettling things. And so they're trying to keep that in control. So that I think that one thing that I love about Esther is that reality that I think is there from the gender distinction. Questions on chapter 1. So this is setting the plot of the novella. We will now introduce the hero. Chapter 2. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, you remember Vashti, what she'd done, what had been decreed against her. Clearly he's sad and lonely. So then the king's servants who attended him said, oh, not beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. And the king appointed commissioners in all provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in the citadel of Susa under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, and let their cosmetic treatments be given to them. And let the girl who pleases the queen, the king, be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, so he did so. Now, there was a Jew in the citadel of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with King Jeconiah of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away. Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his cousin. She had neither father nor mother. The girl was fair and beautiful when her father and mother died. Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. So the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered into the citadel of Susa in the custody of Hegai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge over the women. The girl pleased him. This is Hegai, the eunuch. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetic treatments and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen maids in the king's palace, and he advanced her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell. Every day Mordecai would walk around in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. The turn came for each girl to go into King Ahasuerus after being 12 months under the regulations for women, since this was the regular period of their cosmetic treatment. 6 months with the oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfume and cosmetics for women. Clearly, this is exact. Who's going to spend a year getting girls pretty, right? I mean, it takes time to get ready for dinner, not that much time. This is an exaggeration. And when the girl went into the king, she was given whatever she asked for to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she went in, and then in the morning, she came back to the second harem, in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. And she did not go to the king again, unless the king delighted in her, so summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And now Esther was admired by all who saw her. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, and the king loved Esther more than all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion, so that he set the royal crown on her and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet to all his officials and ministers, Esther's banquet. He also granted a holiday to the provinces and gave gifts with liberality. When the virgins were being gathered together and Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her kindred or her people as Mordecai charged her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up. So lots going on here. The king, now sad and lonely, accepts a plan from his advisors to select a new queen. This is the recurrent theme in this book. Ahasuerus doesn't really do anything. He's always kind of sad. And then someone says, well, why don't you do this? He's like, oh, okay. Like he's constantly being led around by his advisors. So they're portraying him that way as an emperor. We encounter, and I also want to say this plan to select a new queen. Don't read this as a beauty pageant, right? This is what you do. This is literally, the reader put in custody. They're rounding up pretty women and putting them in custody to be chosen to be the new queen. So this is horrible, horrible, horrible stuff that happened in the ancient world. And still happens in some parts of the world today. In the course of this, we encounter 2 obscure Jews, Mordecai and his cousin and adopted daughter, Esther. The king's plan to carry off, is the word in Hebrew, the beautiful virgins of the land. That word used for Hebrew, carry off, is the same word used to describe how the exiles were carried off into exile. So they're drawing on that in the same way that Esther's ancestors were carried off into exile. Now Esther herself will be carried off into the king's harem. So the identification of Esther with the totality of the exiled people. And for Esther, this is not a good thing. The prospect of living in a Gentile court as the concubine of a Gentile king would be a double violation, both as a woman, through her own sense of herself, and as a Jewish person, right? And so Mordecai's command that she conceal her identity only would have intensified the conflict. So Esther is being introduced here as someone who is being plucked from the streets, carried off, to be taken and used by a Gentile king for his own pleasures, which would have been horrifying to a Jewish woman trying to survive in exile. So you can't read this like, oh, this is kind of like the Golden Bachelor. That's not what's going on here. This is very different than that. Questions, thoughts? Yeah.
I think this is a lot like Candide, Voltaire, the hyperbole. If you know Voltaire.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. You've got to hear that hyperbole in all of this over and over again to try to advance the story. Esther, however, throughout this whole experience, exercises wisdom and self-control, which earned the admiration of all, and then her coronation as queen. Because when she goes in, she could ask for anything she wants. She asks Haggai, what should I ask for? Give her, ask for this. So Esther, even though she is a powerless woman plucked into a violent trade, she's smart, she's lucky, and she plays her card right to protect herself as best as she can. And so everyone else admires her. She winds up being crowned as the new queen of Persia. All right. Now there is though a pebble in the plot. Dun, dun, dun. Verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the household, became angry and conspired to assassinate Ahasuerus. But the matter came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and it found out to be so, both the men were hanged on the gallows. And this was recorded in the book of the annals of the present. So Mordecai is still keeping an eye on his adopted daughter. And you see that as well, even, when she's taken away. It's not like Mordecai's like, hey, good stuff, won't get to be queen. You see him like every day checking in on the harem, seeing how she's doing. This is a doting, devoted, uncle adopted father. So he's still keeping an eye on her, sitting at the king's gate, and uncovers this conspiracy to assassinate Ahasuerus. He then passes the information to Esther, because of course she would have been vulnerable too, because the eunuchs took care of the king generally in his bedchambers in his royal palace, and so if the eunuch's going to kill the king, they're probably going to wind up killing the queen as well. So he tells Esther what's going on, and Esther tells the king about the plot, but she gives credit to Mordecai. She doesn't claim it for herself. Oh, wise king, look what I have learned. She's not trying to advance herself in any way. She is, she's a person of integrity and honor. So she gives Mordecai credit. And they find out they kill the would-be assassins, and they record it in the royal records. This is an innocuous point, it might seem. Oh, why are you telling me this story? Well, hold on. This will become far more important as the story progresses. So, chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and did obeisance to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance. And then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's command? But when they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. They told Mordecai, in order to see whether Mordecai's word would avail, for he told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance to him, Haman was furious. But he thought it beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So the story happens where Haman uncovers this plot, saves the king, it's put in the records, and then Mordecai's forgotten about. Instead, this Haman fellow winds up devoted, because that's not what you would expect. You'd expect the next chapter to be, so Mordecai did this, and so Mordecai was elevated to the court, but Mordecai's not elevated. So right there, you're catching a sense that something's wrong in this story. So instead, we are introduced to Haman the Agagite, and this is in the Chronicles of Food. No one likes Haman. For those familiar, though, with the Israelite monarchy, they will recall Saul's failure, 1 Samuel 15, to execute Agag, king of the Amalekites, resulting in the loss of the kingdom. If you remember so when Haman is an Agagite, the idea is that he perhaps comes from the descendant of King Agag, who Saul, long ago, if Saul had executed like he'd been told to do, he would have maintained his royal throne, but he lost it through that disbelief. So this is a seed of failure and sin and the enemies of the people of Israel. Mordecai, from the tribe of Benjamin, the same tribe Saul was from, refuses to bow. This could be due to bad blood because he knows he's an Agagite from a very horrible dynasty that's contrary. Could be religious scruples. As a Jewish person, I'm not bowing before anyone. It's likely the former, and very likely has little to do with religious scruples, because we see people in the Hebrew Bible bowing before officials in other parts, so that's not likely a problem, but we'll just leave it at that. But he refuses to bow is the point. Haman rages, the same word in the Hebrew as what the king did. Infuriated, rages at what's going on, determines that response is beneath him to just punish Mordecai, so instead he'll commit genocide. Right? This is, once again, you can hear the hyperbole here. This is such a disproportionate response that it serves as a hint of the horrors that are to come. Apparently I've got that here twice. So genocide is planned, beginning in verse 7. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, which means the lot, before Haman for the day and the month, and the lot fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there were certain people scattered and separated among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws, different from those of every other people, they do not keep the king's laws. So it is not appropriate for the king to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver in the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, so that they may put it into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand, gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you and the people as well to do with it as seems good to you. And the king's secretaries were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman had commanded was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces and to all the officials of the people, to every province in his own script, every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's ring. Letters were sent by the couriers to all the king's provinces, giving orders to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, to plunder their goods. And a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation, calling on all the people to be ready for that day. The couriers went quickly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in the city of Susa. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. So confident is, should be Haman, excuse me, not Mordecai. So confident is Haman of his plot that rather than making his own plan, he cast lots to pick a day. No matter what day falls, I'll be fine to pull this off. That word for lot is pur. That's where Purim comes from. It's lot is what it means in the Hebrew. This is where the feast comes from. The irony here may be that Mordecai's God, rather than Haman's God, has determined the lucky day. They cast lots and they wind up 12 months in the future, right? Which is rather convenient. That gives us time to do something, because if they cast lots and it was next week, people are all ruined at this point, right? So the lots are cast, but they actually don't fall in a way that's going to help Haman, but a way that'll help Mordecai. Haman then uses manipulation and misinformation to argue for the extermination of the Jewish people while not naming them as the Jewish people, just as this people, and they do these horrible things. But he's twirling and playing with truth to kind of get his way. It's shocking that would happen in the political world. Just like in chapters 1 and 2, the king does what his warriors suggest. Ahasuerus has never had an idea of his own he follows through on. And so the trap for the Jewish people has been set. The news is then given on the 13th day of the first month, the day before Passover. So so the Jewish people are hearing this story, and then the news is published on the 13th day of the first month. It doesn't say here that's the day before Passover, but that's what would have happened. So they're all getting ready for Passover. Then they hear news that the king has decided to exterminate their entire people. Right? This is setting a huge set of conflict up in the plot. So there is then grief and action beginning in chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went through the city wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamentation, and most of them lay in sackcloth and in ashes. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her the queen was greatly distressed, and she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, so that he would take off the sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who'd been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn out what was happening and why. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, so that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, charge her to go to the king to make supplication to him and entreat for her people. Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. And then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being told, there is one law, all alike with death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. And I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this. And Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, a night and a day. I and my maids will also fast as you, and after that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai went away and did everything that Esther ordered him. So the confusion of the chapter 3 is ambiguous. Are the Persians anxious about the planned murder of their neighbors? Are they ready to settle scores? Who knows? But the grief of Mordecai is clear. And what's fascinating about this grief and this is in contrast with what's happening in the Citadel. Remember, chapter 3 ended, the whole city's in a turmoil, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. Totally disconnected. Esther herself, the queen of Persia, has no idea what the decree was that's been sent out. So there's the sense that those in power are entirely isolated from the reality of the rest of the city, the rest of the empire. Esther's distressed, once again, though not at first by the plan, because she doesn't know about it, but she's just distressed about Mordecai being in such grief. So we learn that the palace is isolated from the city, also that Esther is also vulnerable. Esther reminds Mordecai of the risk of approaching the king without an invitation. If you do that, you take your life in your own hands. But Mordecai's response in verses 13 and 14 reveal the beating heart of this book. If you don't do anything, God will protect you. You and your family will be decimated. But who knows if it was for such a time? That is the key verse in all of the book of Esther. And indeed, what most scholars think is that is where you find God in this, even though the word God is not used. But who knows if it is for such a time as this, you have been raised to the royal privilege. And what's fascinating is Esther identifies completely with the Jewish people. She takes on this risk. She fasts with them. She mourns with them. She identifies them as her people. She shows that she is a true queen. She's not going to hide who she is and just remain safe in the citadel, but she's fully identifying with her people. So she makes her petition in chapter 5. As on the third day, Esther put on the royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace opposite the king's hall, and the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the palace, opposite the entrance to the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor, and he held out the golden scepter that was in his hand to her. Then Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. The king said to it, "What is it, Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you even half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I prepared for the king." The king said, "Bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther prepared, and while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What's your petition? It will be granted for you. And what is your request? Even half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." And Esther said, "This is my petition and request. If I won the king's favor, if it pleases the king to grant my petition, to fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet, and I will prepare for them, and then I will do as the king has said." So Esther dons her royal dignity in her robes, perhaps in contrast to the demand of King Vashti earlier, right? When it was that bring Vashti in and adjust the crown. She puts on all of her robes, and she doesn't barge into the throne room, though. She comes and stands in the court, waiting to see if she'll be invited forward. So once again, we're seeing the wisdom, the shrewdness of Esther in handling this. And then when the king invites her forward, his offer is like everything in this book. It's ridiculous. He's going to give her half of his kingdom. It's very unlikely that he actually meant that, right? But instead of immediately pleading for her people, she suggests a banquet. Once again, then you'd be like, well, why wouldn't you just try to say, well, there's got to be something more going on in the story here. So rather than being like, quick, king, save the Jewish people, she's working the angles here. So she's, let me throw a banquet for you. Oh, and Haman too. And that the way that's written in the Hebrew truly is, let me throw a banquet for you. Well, and Haman, kind of like an afterthought, right? They have a banquet. And she says, well, let me throw another banquet, right? And then she says, and after that, I will do as the king has said. How the power has shifted. He wants her to tell her what she wants. She's not going to tell him what she wants. She'll throw a banquet, then another banquet. So she'll only do as the king says. So you see how it's slightly, she's turned the wheel in her favor. Now he's like, I don't know what she wants. Come to the next banquet. She's working this man with profound skill. The delay also prepares us for the incriminating scene that's going to follow that we'll get in chapter 5, beginning in verse 9. Haman went out that day happy. 2 banquets. This has been a great period of time and in good spirit. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was infuriated with Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his right, Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions which the king had honored him, how he advanced him above the officials and the ministers. Haman asked even Queen Esther, let no one but myself come with the king to the banquet she prepared. And tomorrow I'm also invited by her, together with the king. Yet all this does me no good as long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting in the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the banquet in good spirits. This advice pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. So whereas before Mordecai refused the vow, he won't even stand up now for Haman. So the conflict is intensified. And this ludicrous parody and juxtaposition for the previous chapter's year is clear. This is a great quote from from the book I mentioned. In the previous chapter, a humble woman reluctantly takes on the trappings of royalty and risks her life to save others. But now in this chapter, a megalomaniac who thinks he's royalty plots to destroy others, right? I mean, you can see Haman is echoing Ahasuerus. You know, he's telling everyone all of his power, all of his money, all the things he can do. But he can't have this one thing I want. The gallows proposed are also ridiculous. This is 80 feet. Who's going to build a gallows 80 feet high? This is ridiculous. This is clearly straining credulity. I mean, actually, the Hebrew word used here is not the word for gallows. It's actually simply a tree or a piece of wood. So it could be an 80-foot high pole that he will impale Mordecai upon. Later Christian scholars, reading this allegorically, saw the tree or wood as an allegorical foreshadowing to the cross. Interestingly enough, you see that in the early church. But we're not going there. We're staying with the Hebrew for this text. And then there's some fortuitous insomnia in this intervening period. On that night of King Christmas, and he gave orders for the book of the records, the annals, and they were to be read to the king. And if you want to fall asleep, bring out the best you had. You will be off in slumberland in no time. I lost my spot. It was found written how Mordecai had told about big Donna and Teresh, who had been eunuchs, who guarded the threshold and who had conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. And then the king said, well, what honor or distinction has been bestowed upon Mordecai? The king's servants who attended said nothing has been done for him. And the king said, who's in the court right now? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows he prepared for him. So the king's servant said, oh, Haman's there, standing in the court. And the king said, oh, let him come in. So Haman came in. And the king said to him, what should be done to the man the king wishes to honor? Haman said to himself, who would the king wish to honor more than me? So Haman said to the king, well, for the man the king wishes to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, and a royal crown on its head. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him robe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him conduct the man on horseback while the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. The king said to Haman, quickly, take the robes of the horses you said, and go do so to the Jew Mordecai, who stands at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman took the robes and the horse and robed Mordecai, and let him ride into the open square of the city, proclaiming, thus shall it be done for for the man whom the king wishes to honor. And then Mordecai returned to the king's house, but Haman returned without mourning, his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends what happened to him, his advisor and his wife Zeresh said, listen, if Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him, but will fall. So, the king has trouble falling asleep, calls for a ruckus to be read. That'll certainly help, as we said. The servant turns just randomly to the story of how Mordecai saved the king's life. And the king's like, oh, brilliant. What does that do for him? This king is a bumbling idiot. Like, we're seeing that clearly, right? And this also resolves the issue created with Haman's introduction, right? Because we expected after he saved the king that Mordecai would be elevated, but instead Haman was elevated. So this is resolving that issue that's created, and the answer is, well, he didn't do anything for Mordecai. He just kind of wrote it in the minutes and called it good. No one finds themselves appreciated if you just write about them in the best minutes. It's an important point for all church leaders to know. So he notices Haman outside waiting for a chance to ask if he can impale Mordecai in an 80-foot high pole, and invites him in and say, what should be done to the man the king wishes to honor? Mordecai cannot imagine it could be anyone other than him if he has one idea, right? So he thinks all the stuff he wants to be done. And the irony, the humor, the satire of the story is like, yeah, great idea. Go do that for Mordecai. And you can imagine Haman's face just dropping. I mean, this is so good. This is so rich. We now come to chapter 7 as Esther now comes to the king. So the conflict is at a boiling point in the story. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, they were drinking wine. They do a lot of drinking in this story. This is how all decisions are made in the book of Esther. And they very rarely seem to be wise. The king is drinking with wine, and the king said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to, what do you think? Half my kingdom? Correct. Half my kingdom, it'll be fulfilled. The queen answered, oh, I want your favor, O king, that pleases the king. Let my life be given to me. This is my petition. And the lives of my people, this is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we'd merely been sold as slaves, men and women, I would hold my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king. King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who has presumed to do this? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. So at the end of chapter 6, the eunuchs bear Haman to the banquet. Remember the last times. And Esther's timing is exquisite. Not only is the wine flowing, remember the Hebrew means drinking party, not feast. Mordecai's loyalty is fresh on his mind because of what happened in the previous night. In the 6-story stake that's constructed, all of this has been done. Haman is rattled from what has happened, right? What he went through yesterday. So this is why she didn't start out with save my people. She was building everything around to get to this point. Her request is clear that save my life and the lives of my people. And she's clear that this is not the enslavement of a troublesome people, which would have been more normal in the ancient world, but this is the annihilation of the queen's own nation, which she says could be seen as an attack on the king himself, and that an enemy has done this. Haman is now revealed as the common enemy, both of the Jewish people and the king. So she's expertly tied it together. So not only is Haman just trying to kill the Jewish people, but he's clearly setting himself against the king. And then we get crime and punishment continuing on in verse 7. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. And when the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence? In my own house? And as the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king, said, look, the very gallows Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saves the king, stand at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him up. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he prepared for Mordecai. The anger of the king was abated. So the king storms in the garden to think about what to do. Haman pleads for his life, throwing himself on the queen's couch. Not a good look. If you're ever in danger, the queen's relaxing on her couch, don't throw yourself on the couch with her. It's a bad idea. He does that. Haman is condemned to die by the excesses of his own ego. ironically punished for a crime he didn't commit. He didn't assault the queen, right? That's the funny thing. What he's killed for has nothing to do with what he did. But perhaps to the one he harbored, wanted to be treated as the king, right? But that's what you keep seeing him wanting over and over again. Unable to annul the decree, as we'll see later in the story, the king adds to it and permits the Jews to destroy anyone seeking to kill him. And the Jews go and kill 75,000 people. But they take no plunder from the murder of those who sought to kill them. This is echoes of the band when they're in the promised land, that you will kill these people as a righteous judgment, but you will not take plunder from them. And then an annual commemoration is sent out to the kingdom, and Mordecai finally joins the royal court. And there's a few more chapters we don't have time to get into, but that's the heart of the story of Esther. Questions, comments, conversation. Yeah, Matt.
I have one question. I'm having trouble talking. You pointed out one line which you said was the presence of God's word.
Yeah.
Story. And that's neat, but it seems to me that everything in it invites some possible theological interpretation, but that connects for you with another question.
Yeah.
When you call something a novella,
yeah,
is that an attempt to contain its theological power? Because it's basically a fiction, not of the same stature as say Genesis?
No, I would say not at all. And particularly parts of Genesis are written like a novella as well, right? And I think it's quite the opposite. And I think this is where I think contemporary thinking about Christianity and art and literature has fallen woefully short. I remember when I was in college, my best friend Caleb used to talk about Christian music. It's kind of funny given the sermon today. And he'd say, Christian music, who cares if it talks about God? Be the best music. That's Christian music. That's what it should be. But it's in Christian literature. Well, it should be the best literature. And then it was in a period of time. When Dostoevsky is clearly, Brothers Karamazov is clearly dealing deeply in Christian themes, right? But not the kind of heavy-handed way of more modern attempts at Christian literature. So I would say, and in fact, the fact that God doesn't appear by word adds to the power of the telling of the story. And you see this as well, because remember, we have done the intro to the Hebrew Bible. Early in the Hebrew Bible, God's all over the place. He's walking in the garden, he's talking to Abraham, talking to Job, like all over the place. But as the Hebrew scriptures progress, you stop seeing God, then you see messages of God, and now we're here at the end of the story, God seems to be absent entirely from the narrative. And so in some ways that resonates, I think, with our own experience of the divine. So the question is, God's not going to show up and tell me what to do, but how instead could God be a part of what's going on behind the scenes? And more importantly, how am I called to take agency in my own time? Because that's why I think Esther is so profoundly good, because God is not the deus ex machina that resolves the plot. The power is in a woman who takes agency and works with wisdom and cunning to save her people. So it kind of goes back to that, the great line from from a lot of sermons, I ask God, when are you going to do something to solve this problem? And God said, I was just going to ask you the same question. The agency of the person becomes far more important than just the name of God showing God. Go ahead, Matt.
I gotta get my voice back one of these days. I think that's so much neater, because so many times people read a story and they say, where's the theme? And then they identify one sentence, and what this is all showing, and it connects with the way in which God seems to disappear in the later books. There's that book by, I think it's Jack Miles. It's saying that the agency of the individual person acting in a situation out of values is the real theological significance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you also see that this is, for me, a beautiful one, is you're seeing how literature is developing, right? Because ancient texts weren't writing the way this is being written. You're not, but you're seeing here that this is an era in the ancient world where literature and storytelling is really reaching a height that it had not had before. Greg, you your hand up.
You spent so much time with context and talking about Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes. And they're coming from the established monotheism. They're coming from Zoroastrianism,
right?
The God, Hermas, the God of truth.
Yeah.
You better do things this way, or else. But now when the expansion is happening, you're running into a group of people that adhere to a different monotheistic practice. I'm wondering, is this a story of competing understandings of God, even though God is not mentioned here? This is a challenge to what has not just patriarchy, but the whole practice. And I'm a little bit, I question a little bit of how willing Cyrus and Darius will be to allow other practices. Okay, you can have your other practices, but you still better give me 100% tribute in all things. If you choose not to, this is what we do. The God of truth, you're either with me or against me. Yeah. That's what this king, even though he's clueless, it's still, you're with me or against me. Yeah. But you see a victory of a competing monotheistic practice, a victory of what will be Judaism, and then maybe Christianity. I don't know. That's where my thoughts go.
I think you're totally right, Greg. And I think particularly if you remember that one of the essential parts of Judaism is the wisdom tradition, right? Because that's lost on Christianity. Christianity for 500 years has argued about justification and grace and stuff like that, and has forgotten this beautiful wisdom tradition of which Esther is the personification of maybe wisdom. And so if the beginning of wisdom is attention to the Torah, following God, then clearly the God of Israel, in the wisdom of following that God, can topple anything, can turn a woman from a sexual slave into a queen who's wrapped the king around her finger. I think you're absolutely right that there is a strong push against kind of the bumbling foolishness, not only the religion, but of the wisdom of the Persian Empire and those in authority, compared to the wisdom of Esther as an exemplary of the best of the Jewish people and tradition. Yeah, there's a huge polemic going on here. Yeah. Anything else? It's a great story. It's a great text. And so just so you know, before we wrap up, my plan is indeed to push on and to just sprinkle in sort of the Hebrew Bible in on Sundays when we have breaks in faith formation series that we're kind of doing on. So keep your eye out if that's something you're interested in, and I'll continue to let you know when we do those. Next week, though, we were going to do 2 Into the Hebrew Bibles, and I forgot I'm out of town next week to be in Nashville with Bethany's family for Thanksgiving. And so next week, I will not be teaching, but Mac will be teaching. So please be aware of that.
We'll be doing our final discussion of the climate crisis, but our focus is going to be practical. What should we be doing?
Excellent.
Go Bucks.
Go Bucks. All right, thank you. Yeah, go God. And I'm so sorry if you're an MSU fan. You had a very hard night, but Mac is super happy. Thank you all. I'm going to turn the recording off and have a lovely day. Go in peace. Love and serve the Lord. So clear it up.
It's a great book.
Thank you.